From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Kamala Harris attacks Donald Trump's fitness for office, while Trump says he'd consider exempting first responders and members of the military from paying taxes. We'll have the latest from the trail as they both campaign in Michigan with our political panel, plus delve into election security with Michael Waldman, president and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice, this hour. Also joining us, Jennifer Kavanagh of Defense Priorities on what happens next in the Middle East after Israel's killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. But we begin on this Friday evening with the latest from the campaign as Kamala Harris is in Michigan this evening, seizing on a new report that Donald Trump canceled an interview due to exhaustion.
It should be a concern if he can't handle the rigors of the campaign trail. Is he fit to do the job? I think it's a legitimate question.
The Trump campaign has denied the report. Trump himself also is in Michigan this evening. So joining you now for more is Bloomberg's Megan Scully. Megan, obviously it is no coincidence. They are both focusing on a state like Michigan. Key battleground, just 18 days left to go. What should we make of the kind of closing arguments, though, we're getting from them? Kamala Harris focusing increasingly frequently on age and acuity.
Yes, it's sounding a little bit like the Republican argument over the summer when Biden was in the campaign, for sure. We're definitely going to see her continue to hammer that pretty hard. She did it in the Bret Baier interview on Fox News. But we're also going to see them really dispatching their most powerful surrogates. And for Harris, that is the Obamas. You'll see the former president with her in Georgia next week, and you'll see Michelle Obama in Michigan. And on the Trump side, we have Elon Musk, who I think has pretty much moved into the state of Pennsylvania and is did his first rally there yesterday and plans several more.
Yeah, and we've had some great reporting on how frequently Donald Trump is bringing up Elon Musk, a pretty popular name to raise at his rallies, as Musk is in the running, we understand, for running this Government Efficiency Commission. As we talk about government efficiency and the ledger of the government when it comes to revenue and spending, Donald Trump also proposed a new tax idea today that members of the military, firefighters, policemen would be exempt from paying them. I spoke with Ben Harris of the Brookings Institution about that idea on the early edition of Balance of Power.
His approach has been to start with the TCJA extension, which costs $5 trillion over 10 years, and then to add on all of these special tax breaks that really don't have an economic justification. You know, as you just mentioned, tax breaks for wages, for tips, tax breaks for particular occupations, tax breaks for people who receive Social Security benefits, which, by the way, would completely undermine Social Security and Medicare finances. We're already up probably close to around $10 trillion and counting. This isn't a realistic set of proposals. They're just far too expensive to ever make it through Congress.
So on that point, Megan, are any of these ideas ever going to make it through Congress?
Well, it's beginning to sound a little bit like a student council president race with lots of promises that likely are not going to come to fruition. Taxes will be high on the congressional agenda next year, but all of these tax breaks are going to be difficult to pass through. You know, you've now had both sides weigh in on tipped wages, for instance. Maybe there could be some sort of an agreement there. But tax cuts cost the government money, essentially, in terms of revenue that they're not bringing in. And then that then translates into more debt and, more deficit spending. So it is going to be a very difficult needle to thread, and I don't think all of those tax breaks are going to make it through next year. Okay, well, I also just wonder why we're still talking about tax breaks or new ones at this point in the race. Historically, do we see new policy ideas introduced this late in the game with just 18 days to go? I think that right now the race is so tight, maybe one of the tightest races we've ever seen. So it is a matter of mobilizing voters to get them out to the polls. So if you're dangled a promise or even just a proposal of, well, maybe you won't have to pay taxes or as much in taxes, that could get you off the couch. And I think that's what both of these candidates are trying to do at this moment, because it's going to come down to who gets off the couch.
Yep, it's going to be a turnout game. Bloomberg's Megan Scully, thank you so much. Now, in the Middle East, calls for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas have grown following the killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar yesterday in Gaza. Here's President Biden speaking from Germany about that earlier today.
The death of leader Hamas represents a moment of justice. He had the blood of Americans and Israelis, Palestinians and Germans and so many others on his hands. I told the Prime Minister of Israel yesterday, let's also make this moment an opportunity to seek a path to peace, a better future in Gaza without Hamas.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Courtney McBride, who reports on national security for us. So, Courtney, the U.S. has been advocating for a ceasefire for months on end. Is there a real feeling among the administration that this time is different, that the death of Sinwar fundamentally changes the equation for those at the negotiating table?
I think there's hope that this could present an opportunity, but they're also realistic that, you know, Sinwar will have a successor. One is perhaps already in an acting role, but that this could offer a chance to bring Hamas back to the negotiating table. For about a month, Sinwar had refused to communicate even with the mediators who were representing Hamas's interests at the table.
Well, there's also the question of a body or an entity not at the table, which is Iran. Hamas, of course, being a proxy of Iran. And we're still waiting for Israel's response to Iran's attempted missile attack from just a few weeks ago. And we also heard from President Biden about that earlier today. He was asked specifically if he knew what the response would be and when it would be coming. Here was that exchange.
Mr. President, do you have a good understanding right now what Israel is going to do in response to Iran's October 1st attacks and when they will actually respond to Iran?
Yes and yes.
Can you tell us?
No and no.
No and no, he will not say what it is or when it will be. But do we have a sense of timing, Courtney? We have been waiting for weeks now.
We have been waiting, but there's not. Certainly, U.S. officials have not disclosed to reporters, despite our best efforts, what the timing might be. I think a lot of the focus in the conversations with the Israeli government has been on target selection and trying to make sure that this response, which the U.S. is adamant is justified, not perpetuate a cycle of retaliatory strikes between the two countries.
Well, and I wonder what role Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, will be playing in still trying to help guide Israel through that retaliation and, of course, pushing for the ceasefire, because President Biden says he's going back to the region for, what, the 11th time in the next few days?
Yes. We don't know when he would go at this stage, but, yes, this would be the 11th trip to the region since October 7th of 2023.
And what purpose would this particular trip serve? Is it more about the ceasefire after the death of Sinwar, or about making sure Israel feels fortified in the U.S.'s ability to support its defense if it hits Iran?
Likely all of the above. Ordinarily on these trips, the Secretary meets with representatives of the Israeli government, of neighboring governments in the region, and tries to advance all of these objectives of the administration. And that also could include trying to tamp down tensions and create a path toward peace in Lebanon.
Yeah, because there's a whole other front we have to consider here as well. Bloomberg's Courtney McBride, thank you so much. Now, still ahead, we'll continue this conversation on what's next in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and Hezbollah for that matter, with Jennifer Kavanagh of Defense Priorities, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Sinwar's death also provides an extraordinary opportunity to achieve a lasting ceasefire, to end this awful war, and to rush humanitarian aid into Gaza.
That was Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin earlier today on what the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar might mean for Gaza and the Middle East as a whole. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Jennifer Kavanagh, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities. Jennifer, welcome back to Balance of Power. We have been talking a lot in the last day and change about the U.S. seemingly using Sinwar's death as a renewed push toward a ceasefire. Do you believe a ceasefire agreement is more likely today than it was yesterday before we heard this news?
I think it's more likely, but still very unlikely. I don't think that this really changes any of the underlying fundamentals, especially from the Israeli point of view. The narrative coming from the Biden administration has been that Sinwar was the major holdup here. But it's important to remember that every negotiation has two parties. And Netanyahu has been pretty clear that he doesn't see this as the end of the war. I think he said he sees this as the beginning of the end. Israel's objectives in Gaza have always been frustratingly vague and expansive at the same time. It's not really clear what they're aiming at, what the day after looks like. And the goals aren't specific. They've had a number of tactical victories, but what Netanyahu seems to really want is a new face of the Middle East. And killing one leader isn't going to accomplish that. So unfortunately, I don't think this will end up being a turning point.
Well, it's interesting as we consider Israel's objectives here that they wanted from the get-go after October 7th a complete eradication of Hamas. You can take out the leadership, you can take out fighters and try to go after their military capabilities and infrastructure. But can you ever defeat the ideology? Jennifer, I just wonder if this is a chase that will ever truly end.
There's been a ton of research looking at this question about whether or not decapitation strikes are actually effective when you take out the leader. And it varies a lot, depending on the type of group and the context and how it's done. Hamas is a group where I'm really skeptical that it's going to work. Hamas has been around for a long time. They have a very specific set of political objectives. They want a Palestinian state. And that idea, that yearning for a Palestinian state carries through from generation to generation. If you go back about 20 years, 2004, 2005, the Israelis had a similar string of tactical successes where they were able to take out a number of Hamas leaders. And violence died down for a very short time, and there was a lot of triumphalism that this was the end, that they had ended this challenge. But by 2007, Hamas was taking over Gaza, and now you see where we are today. So these types of groups that have these really clear generational political objectives are very hard to take out with just decapitation strikes.
Well, so we should consider the next generation then. On the early edition of Balance of Power, we spoke with Jonathan Panikoff about who the next leader of Hamas could be, and this is what he said.
If Hamas actually elects somebody outside of Gaza, somebody like Khalil Hayya, who's been the chief negotiator since Haniya's death, then yeah, I think it probably does represent an opportunity that you actually could get to some sort of hostage ceasefire deal. But the reality is, if Hamas decides, no, we're going to double down and elect somebody like Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, who was one of the chief architects, frankly, of the tunnel infrastructure, it's going to make it much, much harder.
Do you agree with that assessment, Jennifer? How does the actual geographic base of Hamas's next leader matter?
So I would agree, but I would also expect that this is not necessarily an either-or situation. It hasn't been uncommon for Hamas in the past to have a leader outside and also some sort of military-oriented leader inside Gaza. And in theory, any type of ceasefire would have to have the agreement of both parties. So I would expect that it's maybe not an either-or situation. The other thing to think about when you're talking about the next generation is who's going to be the new fighters. Hamas has lost, by most accounts, a significant portion of its fighters. But about 60% of Hamas, most experts estimate, are made up of orphans from previous conflicts with Israel. And if you think about the number of orphans that have been that have suffered the loss of one or both parents in this current round of conflict, it seems to me that the ground for recruiting new fighters, which is equally important as leadership, is going to be very favorable for Hamas.
That's an excellent point, Jennifer, as we consider the tens of thousands of innocent lives that have been lost amid all of this. The fighters are one thing for Hamas or other Iranian proxies. The money and the resources flowing to them is another. That comes from Iran. So what is Iran's role from here? How do you see Iran reacting to the news of Sinwar's death, as it is still awaiting retaliation from Israel?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Hamas and Hezbollah do get a significant portion of their resources from Iran, and those funding networks have been disrupted. And new sanctions are likely coming and have come for Iran, which will affect its ability to get resources to these groups. But again, this is something, these funding networks that are very difficult to cut off permanently. Once you cut them off in one place, they tend to regrow in another place. For Iran, I do think that this is a moment of strategic reconsideration how it wants to move forward. It has both of its proxies, or all of its proxies in the region, have suffered significant losses. And this was a big part of its regional deterrence or its regional strategy. I think that the Iranian leadership is likely thinking a little bit about how to proceed from here. Do you double down on the proxies? Is this the right time to go full in on the nuclear program? Is this the time to build relationships with other neighbors to try to cool things down or take the heat off? I think those are all options that could be being considered.
Well, let's talk about Israel's options as well, because as I mentioned, we are still awaiting Israel's response to the missile attack that Iran launched at it at the beginning of this month. President Biden told reporters today he does know what that response will be and when it will happen, even though he is not sharing that publicly at this time. But what are the different options and degrees of escalations that you see as most likely here, Jennifer?
Well, I think there's maybe four main types of targets that have been discussed. One is to go after nuclear facilities. One is to go after Iran's oil infrastructure. One is to hit some sort of civilian target. And the fourth, which I think is the most likely, is to hit military facilities. Targeting the oil facilities, I think, would potentially have ripple effects that would affect the global economy. So I think Israel has faced a lot of pressure not to go that route. Attacking nuclear facilities, not clear it would work, and they would require a lot of U.S. support for that. So that's a place where I think the U.S. does have a little bit more of a say. The military strikes would be sort of the least escalatory and the most proportional to Iran's attack. So I think that's the most likely. I think the timing depends a little bit on how quickly the U.S. air defense systems get there. The U.S. has agreed to provide some more powerful air defense. It's called a THAAD. It's an anti-ballistic missile interceptor. I don't think Israel will take whatever action it's planning to take until those are in place, because I do think they're suffering from low stockpiles of air defense and are concerned about Iran's retaliation.
Well, as we consider the U.S. here, just finally, Jennifer, Anthony Blinken, we understand, is going back to the region. This will be his 11th trip. Do you expect it yields something tangible?
Unfortunately, not really. I think the goal of the administration here is to seize on what appears to be a potential window of opportunity. But as I said at the start, I think that those hopes are going to be frustrated. I just don't see a lot of movement. I don't know that Hamas will be ready to deal until they have a new leader and kind of figure out their bearings after losing Sinwar. And it doesn't seem like the Israelis are really focused on negotiation. Their concern seems to be about retaliation against the hostages for Sinwar's death, not about finding a way to get those hostages out. So unfortunately, I think this trip will, like the last ones, be a failure unless the U.S. is ready to use the leverage that it has on Israel. Israel does have depleted stockpiles of weapons and is dependent, much more dependent than it was in a year ago, on U.S. weapons. So the U.S. does have leverage it could use if it wanted to.
It's just a question of if it will. Jennifer Kavanagh, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities. Thank you. Coming up, one of the prediction markets has been tilting towards Donald Trump recently. The questions are being raised about who's pushing what in what direction. We'll have more on that story next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I must say, in the last 12 days, the market and the inside of the market is very convinced Trump is going to win. You can see it in the bank stocks, you can see it in crypto. I would have to guess Trump is the favorite to win the election now, but who knows what these polls even mean? No one even responds to them anymore.
Billionaire investor Stanley Druckenmiller on Bloomberg TV earlier this week on what the prediction markets and Wall Street are thinking about who may win the upcoming election. Over the last few weeks, bets on a Trump victory have surged on the crypto-based prediction platform Polymarket. But new questions are being raised about who exactly is behind those wagers. And joining me now for more is Bloomberg's Michael Reagan. Michael, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that this surge on Polymarket, the bets being loaded up on Trump, might actually just be from a few accounts. What do we know?
Yeah, Kelly, so this is something that's been brewing on X for a couple weeks now. Basically, if you look at Polymarket, what it does is it takes the amount of money in the form of crypto being bet on that one candidate will win and the amount that the other candidate will win. And then it implies some probabilities based on how much money is being bet on either side. Now, for a long time, those probabilities looked a lot like the poll numbers that we would see. Kamala Harris was up by 1% or 2%, and then they were sort of neck and neck. But about 2 weeks ago, we really began to see a divergence where the probability for Trump was far greater, to the point where today it's about a 60% probability for Trump and 40% for Vice President Harris. And what people on X and the Journal is reporting about today have discovered is that there are these 4 wallets that are betting very, very heavily in favor of Donald Trump to the tune of $30-some million. Now, I'll put that in perspective. There's been a little over $1 billion bet on either Trump or Vice President Harris. So if you think about it as a small cap stock, if someone suddenly invests $35 million in a small cap $1 billion stock over a short period of time, that's going to move the price. And so the thinking is that these big whales are moving the probabilities in this Polymarket betting operation.
Mike, we've got less than a minute left here, but is the prevailing thinking in crypto markets specifically that Kamala Harris is necessarily going to be bad news? She's advocating for better regulation.
Yeah, the thinking is, the hope at least among the crypto industry is that she will at least be a little bit more friendly to the industry than President Biden was. Now, Donald Trump obviously has really embraced the industry. She hasn't gone that far, but the comments she's made and the policy plan she's announced suggests that it would not be as harsh of an environment for crypto as it was under President Biden.
All right, Bloomberg's Michael Regan, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Now coming up, it's 18 days until Election Day, but the battle for the White House could last well beyond that. Michael Waldman of the Brennan Center for Justice will join on the legal challenges that could follow the vote next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think this thing could go on for days after the election. It doesn't mean that it won't be questioned, that doubt won't be out there, that legal challenges will happen, that Trump will not agree that he lost if he did, and we'll see how that all plays out. But no, I think the 76 days between November 5th through January 20th, the inauguration day, may be just as important as what happens on election night.
Joe Trippi, Democratic strategist now with the Lincoln Project, where he's senior advisor, yesterday on Balance of Power, talking about how long the post-election process might take for us to actually know definitively who is going to be president of the United States. Joining me now for a closer look here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Michael Waldman, president and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice. Michael, thanks so much for being here. We've got 18 days to go, but I think you and I both know that that doesn't mean this race is settled 18 days from now. What are you bracing for?
Well, I think that a few things are happening at once. On the one hand, we should never lose sight of how extraordinary it is that there are so many efforts to undermine public confidence and trust in the voting before it happens. There's no doubt that the election deniers are much better organized than they were in 2020, much better funded, on the one hand. On the other hand, the election system has been hardened. Election officials are ready. From what I can see, they're working with law enforcement. Congress passed a law to make it much harder to mess with the Electoral College. And so the bottom line is, in terms of what we all need to do as voters and as citizens, there's no reason to think that voters should be able to vote in a way that is free and fair and without incident. You're right, though, that what I'm more worried about are all the things that could come afterwards. The efforts, even if there's nothing legitimate to worry about, to discredit the results. Yes, there's always some litigation and other things. That's appropriate. But we could certainly see a major effort to discredit the results, even if they are clear as day.
Well, obviously, we all saw what happened in 2020. No court actually found substantive Donald Trump's claims that he, in fact, won the election or that Joe Biden really lost it. But I wonder if lessons have also been learned by the way 2020 was litigated. How do you expect 2024 cases might be argued differently depending on how the loser feels about the fact that they lost?
Well, you're right. In 2020, there were dozens and dozens of rulings from Republican and Democratic judges who said, no, there was no evidence of misconduct, of a rigged election, of fraud. And there's encouraging evidence already that some of these guardrails are beginning to really hold. In Georgia, just in the last few days, the state election board, which was packed with MAGA supporters who Donald Trump hailed at his rallies, had ordered that there be hand counts of the numbers of ballots and a whole bunch of other things. And a judge in Georgia said, no, it's way too close to the election to do these things, and blocked it. You're seeing in Pennsylvania an effort by a number of legislators to try to stop the counting of votes from people living overseas, which is mostly military people. And I'll tell you, as a former Blue Star parent myself, I'm very concerned about that. A lot of veterans groups and others went to court today to argue that this is wrong. So a lot of this stuff is playing out before the election. The big question is going to be the court of public opinion. You're seeing a lot of rumors being spread, a lot of disinformation being put out there. I think it's for all of us and for the media to knock those down as soon as they come up, and not let the fact, as you said, as Joe Trippi said, it's going to take a few days to count the votes. That's not a sign of problems or chaos at the polls. That's actually election workers doing their job.
Well, and we know that many of them in 2020 faced threats, were defamed. In fact, some of them have won court cases around defamation themselves in the case of a few poll workers in Georgia. As we consider the way in which all of this could work through the courts, how much do you expect the Supreme Court to be involved in whatever happens after the election? They're ultimately going to be the final say here, possibly?
You know, possibly. It's only happened in the last century once in American history, in the year 2000. In 2020, the Supreme Court, led by John Roberts, stayed very far away from getting involved in those cases. When Texas sued Pennsylvania, they swatted it down. They knew that they should not be making those decisions. I hope that that's what they do again this time. And it's frankly hard to see the path for a case to get to the Supreme Court. Everyone kind of assumes, oh, well, they're going to make the final call. You need a case to get to them that would enable them to do that. This has, in my view, been a very political court, and I would be nervous about what they would do, but that doesn't mean they will even necessarily get a case that would be significant.
Well, fair enough. As we consider the way this is being discussed on the campaign trail, it was brought up by the Republican vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, who was in Pennsylvania earlier this week, and he had this to say to voters about election integrity.
This election is tight, my friends. I think we're going to win, but in Pennsylvania and a few other states, it's really tight. And we have to get so many votes that whatever crap the Democrats pull, we are going to overwhelm their BS and we're going to make Donald Trump the next president of the United States. The RNC has done more on election integrity in the past 3 months than the Republican Party had done in the last 3 years. It's a record to be proud of, and I won't tell you that everything is perfect, but I will tell you we're doing a lot better now than we were 4 years ago.
We obviously aren't where we were 4 years ago in a lot of senses, Michael, including that the 2020 election happened in the middle of a pandemic, which is why so many people were choosing to vote absentee rather than going to their polling places. So if we're considering the challenges that were brought around mail-in voting, absentee voting in 2020, do you believe the narrative around that, the trust the American people have in that method of voting has been repaired, or is there still enough rhetoric around the idea that maybe mail-in voting is stupid or somehow rigged, that it actually could make people choose not to vote in that way?
Well, of course, J.D. Vance and his running mate often say two different things, because they say that it's a big problem, but they also want to urge their own supporters to take advantage of it. You're right that in 2020, because of the extraordinary situation of the pandemic, the number of people who voted by mail but more or less doubled. It was an extraordinary civic achievement that in the middle of a pandemic that had shut down society, we had the highest voter turnout since 1900. And Donald Trump's own Department of Homeland Security said it was the most secure election in American history. It was really a great civic achievement. In this election, a lot of people are kind of going back more toward how they voted previously. A lot of people will be voting in person on Election Day. A lot of people will be voting early, and many people will be voting by mail. But they happily don't have the worry of the pandemic and the health issues. That was why people were voting by mail often. A lot of the charges in 2020 were absolutely crazy, that voting machines were flipping votes, you had to search in ballot paper for bamboo fibers because that would prove they were printed in China and things like that. And a lot of it drawing on people's unease about the changes in voting during the pandemic. This time, there really haven't been those changes. And I'm very concerned that partisan operatives are now spreading lies about non-citizen voting, which they claim, lots and lots of people are doing. States have a multiplicity of systems in place to make sure that only citizens vote, and only citizens do vote. So when people hear about non-citizen voting after the election, oh, wow, that was a real problem, people need to have their kind of guard up, because it's just not true. It's a lie, and it's partisan politicians using that lie deliberately to stoke public distrust in the system. I don't think these things are going to lead to an upending of the result, but they could lead to a collapse of public trust even further in our democracy, and that would be a real shame.
All right. Unfortunately, we have to leave it on that somber note. Michael Waldman, President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, coming up, we'll turn back to geopolitics and the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar as it reverberates throughout the Middle East, with President Biden hoping for a ceasefire.
We think that there's a possibility of working for a ceasefire in Lebanon, and it's going to be harder in Gaza, but we agree that there has to be an outcome.
Our political panel joins next on how that's factoring into the presidential race on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
He was not a good person. That's my reaction. That's sometimes what happens.
Does the death of Sinwar make peace easier or more difficult?
I think it makes it easier.
Why is that?
You got to talk to Prime Minister Netanyahu about it?
He's called me, yes.
What was that conversation?
He's called me. I have not spoken. I'm going to speak to him probably now.
That was former President Donald Trump after landing in Michigan this afternoon, answering reporter questions on the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. This follows comments that Vice President Kamala Harris made yesterday during a campaign stop in Milwaukee.
Israel has a right to defend itself, and the threat Hamas poses to Israel must be eliminated. Today, there is clear progress toward that goal. Hamas is decimated, and its leadership is eliminated. This moment gives us an opportunity to finally end the war in Gaza.
Joining me now for more here on Balance of Power is this evening's political panel. Lester Munson, Republican strategist and co-head of the international practice at BGR Group, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Welcome to you both. It has been quite a week, including with this news from yesterday. Jeannie, the U.S. does seem to be using the death of Sinwar as impetus for a further push toward a ceasefire. With 18 days to go until a presidential election, how could a ceasefire in the Middle East, if it's able to happen, influence this race?
You know, I think, politics aside, it would obviously be welcomed by everybody, particularly the families of these hostages, if we could get to a ceasefire and get those hostages home. That said, politically, it would be welcome news, certainly for the Biden administration and for Kamala Harris by extension, because this is politically really something that is weighing down on the campaign. She still has people from the Arab American community and others, particularly on the left, who are saying that they are not only are they not endorsing her, they may not turn out to vote because they are frustrated that the Biden administration has not done enough, as they see it, for the humanitarian effort against with the Palestinians in Gaza. So that's where I think it would be welcome from them politically, but of course, more importantly, to get these hostages home if possible.
Yeah, there are human considerations first and foremost. But Lester, as we do consider politics here as well, if it would be on net better for Kamala Harris for there to be a ceasefire than Donald Trump, does that actually give Benjamin Netanyahu greater incentive to not agree to one? What are his interests here? I don't think Bibi Netanyahu really cares which candidate benefits from the decisions he's going to make. But he cares who's president, right? I'm not sure that's true. What Bibi Netanyahu needs to do is defend the Israeli people from the Hamas threat. He's going to do what is necessary to eliminate that threat, as we have seen very clearly for the last few months. So I don't think his calculus is about whether leaning this way or that way is going to help this demographic or that demographic in Michigan or some other swing state. He's very clearly focused on the war at hand. And frankly, I think it's an opportunity for the vice president and the White House to actually recognize that, speak plainly about things, and quit trying to work one angle or another or shave the edges off of things for political reasons. Far better speak the truth, speak plainly. If you support Israel, just continue supporting Israel and say that clearly, and not push for something that is really not going to happen in the next 17 days. Well, 17 days is one thing. The next 3 months, Jeannie, are another. That's basically how long Joe Biden has left in his presidency. How will where this conflict is by then shape his legacy? Oh, it's going to have a fundamental impact on his legacy, and he knows it. I think one of the things that Joe Biden has taken a great deal of pride in, and rightly so, is his ties with and ability to work with our allies. And we see him over in Europe, probably his last trip there. And as it pertains to the Middle East, those allies are going to be critical, because if we want Arab stabilization in the Gaza Strip and some kind of political solution, which is going to be necessary to end this, it is going to be via our Arab allies, whether it is the UAE, whether it is Saudi Arabia. So I think as we contrast, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and we think about Joe Biden's legacy, the ability to work with allies is critically important. And of course, Donald Trump has not shown a good deal of interest in that outside of Israel, and Joe Biden certainly has. All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Lester Munson, stay with me. Is coming up. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are making their final campaign pushes in these last 18 days. We'll have more on that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
My opponent feels like she does not have to be here. If you really wanted Vice President Harris to accept your invitation, I guess you should have told her the funds were going to bail out the looters and rioters in Minneapolis.
Thou shalt not bear false witness to thy neighbor.
Indeed, especially thy neighbor's election results.
And maybe don't say anything negative about Catholics.
I would never do that, no matter where I was. That would be like criticizing Detroit in Detroit.
Donald Trump taking jabs at Kamala Harris at the Al Smith dinner in New York last night, and part of the video she sent instead of attending. Back with me now here on Bloomberg TV and radio is our political panel, Lester Munson and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. So that was last night in New York. Fast forward to this morning in New York, Lester. We have Donald Trump on a number of shows, including Fox and Friends on Fox, talking about how he's asked Rupert Murdoch not to air any negative ads about him in this final stretch of the race. Signal that it's getting to him a little bit?
Well, you know, why not give it a shot? He's got a few friends in the media. Why not try to get them on side? I think we're going to see both of these candidates try anything they can in the next 2.5 weeks. It's so close. Any little thing could make the difference, which means everything makes the difference.
Well, like suggesting that firefighters and policemen and members in the military won't have to pay taxes, possibly. That's a new policy proposal from Donald Trump today.
Waiters, waitresses, firemen, sure.
It's 20 million people. Add it to the list, Jeannie. Is it a little late to be introducing new policies at this point?
It is. It is. What about professors? What about people who work on TV? I think this list needs to be growing
Journalists,
and growing.
Yeah.
You know, it is. But I think on both sides, we see them trying to reach out. And as Lester just said, it is so close. Every vote matters. So apparently Donald Trump is going to keep offering no taxes for everybody in these 6 or 7 swing states who may decide this thing.
And of course, it's not just the message from the candidate, it's the message from the people around the candidate. Elon Musk was in Pennsylvania campaigning on behalf of Trump. It's going to be the Obamas that are alongside Harris in the coming days. Jeannie, how powerful a force in these final days of the election are those surrogate figures?
They are powerful. You know, obviously, Elon Musk comes with $75 million. He's already given. The Trump campaign needs that support for their ground game, and they are getting it from him. He may not be the best on the stump, but he's very good with the money. And then, of course, Barack and Michelle Obama are the leading surrogates on the Democratic side. I've also been impressed myself by Bill Clinton out there in the rural communities. So those surrogates matter, but I think even more important is the ground game, and that's where Kamala Harris certainly has an advantage with her team, and that's where the Trump campaign needs to get more support.
Lester, you're nodding. Are you worried about the Republican turnout operation?
Me personally, no.
Or would you be if you were on the Trump campaign?
Sure. Yes, I would be, because the Harris campaign has a lot more money. Democrats are generally better organized at these things. Republicans tend to act like a pack of wild dogs when it comes to any kind of organizational principle. So, yes, I'd be a little worried about it. Trump is trying to do his own kind of get out the vote thing with these provocative statements and, you know, like the Murdoch thing and some of his other inflammatory rhetoric. That's his own personal get out the vote strategy, very different than the Democrats. Democrats are probably going to benefit by like 1 or 2 percentage points on Election Day because of their very effective get-out-the-vote efforts.
So we obviously have limited days to go here, just 18 of them. Who knows what next week will bring? Plenty of room still for an October surprise. But as we look back on the week that was on this Friday, Lester, who would you say won the week?
I think it looked pretty good for Trump. You know, in the back of my head, I still think Harris is going to win this thing. And I think people are going to move towards her at the end. But, boy, he had a pretty good run there. I think she made a mistake not going to the Al Smith dinner. I think the Sinwar elimination probably helps Trump more than it helps Harris. So he's had a good few days.
Jeannie, what about you?
I think the opposite. I think Trump had a pretty tough time. I think he's asking Rupert Murdoch to pull those ads because he didn't like the 7+ million people that watched Kamala Harris on and with Brett Baier. And also, I think John Micklethwaite's interview with Donald Trump really showed somebody who has very little grasp over the economic situation of the country. So I think he had a tough week. But, you know, I have to say something against Lester because it's Friday afternoon and I'm not with you guys, so I miss you. And so, got to disagree.
Yeah, I love it when the panel disagrees on something. As we think back on, as Jeannie mentioned, the Bloomberg interview Trump did, the Fox interview that Harris did, should they still be doing the media thing for the next 18 days, or is it more about getting on the ground in these states and seeing voters face-to-face in person?
I think anything they can do to kind of get their face in front of voters is a good thing. I'm not expecting either one of them to give us an economics Nobel lecture or something like that, frankly. I think they're both a little shaky on the details, but they need to get out there and explain their vision as best they can. get to those states where it's going to be maybe the one deciding, probably Michigan or Pennsylvania. I expect them to be focused on those two states. Let's remember, Clinton made a big mistake. Hillary Clinton made a big mistake in 2016 by neglecting Wisconsin. I think both campaigns are mindful of that.
All right. Lester Munson and Jeannie Shanzano closing us out on this Friday evening. Thank you both so much for joining me. We survived another week in Washington. And of course, you can always get coverage of Washington with the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. And we'll be back for more next week. So have a good weekend. And thanks for joining us on Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.